Mr. Cawthorn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you mentioned in your testimony that the pandemic also highlighted that more can be done to ensure that workers have timely and equitable access to UI benefits, and that fraudsters, particularly sophisticated international criminal rings, do not flood the UI system with false claims to wrongly acquire taxpayer funds while creating further delays and barriers for genuine claims in need. Secretary, that brings up an interesting question not touched in any other part of your testimony that I can find. Can you answer two questions for me? What was the nature of the unemployment insurance system fraud, and what exactly was the scope of the fraud that you allude to?
I mean, the nature of the fraud was the amount of money that went into the system, and this was back with the CARES investment that was made in the very beginning of the pandemic, and we've never seen, to my knowledge, in any time in the history of our country, this type of fraud that happened, and part of it was because the rules that Congress put on the money that allowed people to access this money, and I support you for doing it, access this money easily. It just opened up a system that was wrong. Number two, you had antiquated systems all across the country, and in the American Rescue Plan, I want to thank Congress for allocating $2 billion because we've created the Office of Unemployment Insurance reform, and we're working with states all across the country, both Democrats and Republican governors, and investments in those states to fix those systems that are antiquated. And we have a system that's, quite honestly, that's a very old system, meaning computer systems all across this country.
Thanks, Secretary. I have another question on the same theme. There's an old saying, I'm sure you've heard it, that haste makes waste. I fear that the reckless spending over the last few years exemplifies that. The PPP program was, for instance, was absolutely right with outright theft. What steps were taken at the time to prevent fraud and abuse in the unemployment insurance program?
We're working now. We're working through with Tiger teams. We've gone, I want to say, 27 states. We've investigated the challenges that they've had and the breakdowns in their system. And what we want to do is make sure that this never happens again, and that we have a system that has strong integrity. Might be the wrong word, but we're gonna need an investment from Congress, and states are gonna need investments across the country to bring up their systems. Part of it is that we have 53 different systems in our country. The way our system works, we fund it through the federal government, a lot of unemployment, but each state is independent. And some of them are working on systems as old as 30 years old, computer systems. So we need to make investments in this system.
All right, let's move on. Staying on something that you seem to be quite proud of in your submitted testimony just before your comments about fraud, I believe you said the UI system in particular, the emergency unemployment compensation programs extended by the American Rescue Plan, provided life-saving benefits to American families throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Milton Friedman once said that inflation is taxation without legislation. Inflation actually robs hardworking families of the fruits of their labor and deprives them of their spending power. Knowing what we know now about the links between inflation and government spending, just how likely is it that funds you are touting as providing life-saving benefits actually contributed to runaway inflation this administration has set loose?
Well, I think at the time that money, whether it was the CARES package, the $600 additional a week, or the $300 by Congress earlier in 2021, I think at that particular moment in time, you're living in that moment, and you have to take care of the constituents and the American people at that particular moment. I personally don't think it necessarily. I think I don't know if it added to inflation, but it certainly hasn't added to inflation to the point of 9%. But you also got to remember, in the context of that particular moment in time, American people were hurting, American people were scared, and we were still in the early days of the pandemic.
All right, Secretary Walsh, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.